We are very delighted tonight to be hosting a great colleague and friend, Waïl Hassan, who is a professor of comparative literature and English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's a specialist in modern Arabic literature and intellectual history, and he's the author of Tayyib Saleh, Ideology and the Craft of Fiction, Immigrant Narratives, Orientalism and Cultural Translation in the Arab American and Arab British Literature, which was published by Oxford in 2011. He has co-edited Approaches to Teaching the Works of Naguib Mahfouz in 2012, and translated Abdul Fattah Khalito, who is a well-known Moroccan literary critic. He translated his book, Thou Shalt Not Speak My Language. He translated the book from Arabic into English, and it was published in 2008. And he also translated, which is something I just learned yesterday, a book from Portuguese by a very well-known Portuguese, Brazilian writer, Alberto Musa, Lughz al-Qaf, from Portuguese into Arabic, which just came out 3 years ago, in 2015. His most recent publication is the edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of the Arab Novelistic Traditions, which was published last year. And he's currently he's writing a book on Arab Brazilian literature, which is a very fascinating topic. Hassan is also the vice president of the American Comparative Literature Association for 2018-19, and he will be president next year from 2019-2020. I'm really, personally, I'm really honored to have him on this stage, because I know he is one of the foremost literary critics and cultural analysts of the Arabic literary tradition, and both from a comparative perspective, he speaks several languages, and he read the literatures of several countries, like French literature, American literature, and so on, now Brazilian literature. So his perspectives of abroad and his insight is keen. So please help me welcome Waïl Hassan to the podium. Come on.
Thank you, Dr. Majid, for this generous introduction, and thank you also for the honor of this invitation to speak at the Tangier Global Forum. It's a tremendous pleasure and an honor to be here. I also want to thank Dr. Murad Benkiran for taking care of the logistics of my visit and making it such a pleasure. And also for Dr. Karim Amin for stepping in literally at the 11th hour to interpret for me from English into Arabic. As a translator, I understand how formidable translation is, and to agree to do a task, to undertake a task like this, literally within hours of the event is truly intrepid, and I salute him. So thank you all very much. Let me perhaps say something first about how I came to this topic. It's not the most obvious topic, and people always express surprise at the fact that there is a Morocco in Brazil. This is part of a large project that I've been working on for several years now, studying the Arab presence in Brazilian literature and Brazilian culture. Many people, Arabic-speaking people from what is now Lebanon and Syria and Palestine immigrated to Brazil and to the Americas as a whole starting from the late 19th century. And this is, I spent several years working on a book that Dr. Majid mentioned about Arab American literature. And the logical continuation of that was to look at the Arab presence in the other giant of the Americas, which is Brazil. Brazil is often compared to the United States because it's such a large country. And it is really and it also hosts the largest, in fact, community of Arab descent in the Americas. So this was how I came to this topic, and I discovered, as I will explain in a moment, that Brazil was the subject of perhaps the most successful telenovela or television series in the history of Brazilian television, as I will explain in a moment. But I'm approaching this topic from the perspective of Orientalism and the critique of Orientalism. So the questions that I ask in this paper are the following. If Orientalism represents a discourse of Western mastery over the Orient, as Edward Said argued, what happens when it travels to another part of the imperialized world, or what we used to call the Third World? What are, for example, the contours of Brazilian Orientalism? If not driven by imperial or foreign policy imperatives, what are its ideological investments? I address these questions by focusing on the representation of Morocco and Islam in Okloni, or the clone, and it's a specimen of the highly popular genre of the telenovela, or novella as it is often called for short, throughout Latin America. Okay? Brazilian telenovelas originated with the birth of radio and television. They use melodramatic plots and tangled storylines that often rely on such devices as coincidence and missed encounters, secrets and revelations, sensational traps set by villains and narrow escapes by the innocent, and episodes ending with a pregnant pause or a cliffhanger, often with a close-up shot on one of the main characters. These are common features of the genre. Brazilian novellas average 180 to 200 episodes. These are very long series, unlike Arabic series, which rarely exceed 30 episodes, for example. And unlike American soap operas, which go on for decades. And these episodes air 5 or 6 days a week over a period of 6 to 8 months, at the end of which all storylines come to a happy conclusion. Settings in Brazilian novellas, especially those aired in prime time, can be very elaborate, often using picturesque outdoor settings, unlike their studio-bound US counterpart. And also, unlike the United States, where the highest paid actors work in Hollywood, in Brazil, the most sought after and the biggest stars are those who work in the novellas. Those novellas are broadcast during prime time, with 3 or 4 new ones running consecutively between 6 or 7 p.m. to around 10 p.m., with the nightly news coming after perhaps the second of those. And occasionally there is also a late night novella starting at 11. Their audiences, therefore, are rather diverse and very large. Only reruns of the most popular novellas are broadcast during the day. And as such, novellas are the most popular narrative form in Brazil, much more so than cinema or literary fiction. Another crucial characteristic of the genre is the use of novellas as a vehicle for often progressive social commentary, ranging from simple instructions on, for example, how to fight the spread of mosquitoes bearing the dengue virus, to controversial issues such as racism, artificial insemination, urban violence, street children, child labor, human trafficking, and in the case of Okloni, human cloning, drug and alcohol addiction, and post-9/11 Islamophobia. These are the 3 main themes of this particular novella. This aspect of novellas has been described as entertainment education, although it also goes hand in hand with commercial product placement, or what has been described by media critics as social merchandising. Entertainment education is rooted in the leftist politics of many of the major novella writers who work for the Globo network. And Globo, as some of you may know, is the largest TV network in Brazil. As Michel and Armand Matelar explain, the links between television fiction writers and critical intellectual circles become obvious when one examines the shelves of their personal libraries. There, Latin American literature stands next to works by historians, anthropologists, economists, and sociologists of the continent. For each screenplay, documentation is carried out by a historian, a sociologist, or an anthropologist. What emerges, at least among some writers, is an intellectual context nourished by the memory of oppression, a memory which cannot be understood without referring to the historical commitment of Latin American intellectuals to the people. End of quote. But since the primary goal of the corporate network for which those leftist writers work is profit, their social consciousness is filtered by the mediations and constraints implied by the production of texts in a particular political and industrial context, which leaves the trace of a calculation on their work. In other words, for authors to reach wide television audiences with their socially conscious message, they rely on the resources of a corporate network that seeks to profit from the enormous popularity of those authors' creations. Clearly, this mutually profitable calculation or compromise has implications for the representation of Arabs and Muslims, to which I will return momentarily. Related to the social consciousness that characterizes Brazilian novellas is their responsiveness both to audience feedback and to national and international events. As an open genre in which composition runs parallel to broadcast, novella writers take into account the input of audiences who write to the network and participate in online forums, focus groups, and opinion polls. So the way this works is the author will begin preparing for a novella 2 or 3 years in advance. By the time the broadcast, doing extensive amounts of research, as we've heard. By the time the first episode airs, the author will have written maybe 2 to 3 months worth of episodes. And about half of those will have been shot. Okay, so writing is about 2 3 months ahead of airing, and so what happens is, because of the popularity of these productions, people discuss them all the time. They write in online forums. They provide a lot of feedback, which then, interestingly, changes the course of the story, because the authors take the audience reactions into account. For that reason, it's called an open genre, right? It's an open to change and modification as time progresses and as people react to what they're seeing on the screen. So the comments of social organizations, churches, activists, politicians, advertisers, media critics, and talk show hosts also feed into the writing process. Several scholars have focused on this aspect of the genre, showing how novellas participate in the construction of national identity and how real and fictional events often vie for space in the public arena. And this is, I'll give you an example that is just incredible. The story of the murder of Daniele Perez. This was the name of an actor, and she was the daughter of Gloria Perez, the author of the novella. Right? The star of the novella was murdered. Novella is called Corpo e Alma, body and soul. She was murdered by her co-star and on-screen lover, Guilherme de Padua, hours after the episode aired, in which her character broke up with his. Okay, try to separate fiction and reality here. There's a love story on the screen. The main actor and actress are actually in love off the screen, and she breaks up with him on the screen. Hours later, he murders her in real life. Okay? This brought, a fictional intrigue into an abrupt, of course, real-life conclusion, plunging the country into weeks of heated debates about the legal system and the social role of television, debates that eclipsed the ongoing Senate impeachment of the then nation's president, Fernando Collor. The president of the country was being impeached, tried in the Senate, and eventually impeached, and yet the top story was the novella and what happened on the novella and the problem of the murder and so on and so forth. So this just illustrates, really, the importance of the genre in the public sphere. All of this renders incomplete any inquiry into Brazilian Orientalism that does not take into account how it manifests itself in one of the most successful novellas in the history of Brazilian television. With a primary focus on the thorny topics of human cloning and drug addiction, the novella also featured a forbidden love story between a Brazilian man and a Moroccan woman that brought in Muslim culture as a third thematic thread. Okay? So that was the order of importance: cloning, substance abuse, and then Islam in the original design of the novella. However, in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, what was originally intended as a subsidiary theme, that of Islam, quickly became the main focus of the novella, eclipsing cloning and substance abuse in prominence and audience engagement for well over half of the series. Okay. Hence the idea of an open genre. Okay. So Okoloni first aired on Brazil's Globo TV network from October 1st, 2001 to June 15, 2002. All right. This is the two main characters here, and this is the Spanish version that began to air almost simultaneously on Telemundo, the Spanish language network in the United States. Written by Gloria Perez, the mother of the actress who was killed several years earlier in another novella by her. The novella had the largest audience in Brazilian television history at the time and was followed by 65% of television sets on average, and 75% of television sets for the final episodes in the greater Sao Paulo area. I mean, imagine that 3 or 4 television sets were airing this series, okay? It was also exported to 91 countries, and I think it was dubbed also into Arabic in Tunisia and in Lebanon. So this, if this tremendous success was not fully anticipated by Globo's executives, they had nonetheless prepared several lines of merchandise to be released within weeks of the novella's first airing. Items included attached wrist and finger bracelets, like the ones worn by the leading Moroccan character by the name of, her name is Jadi, to Moroccan leather sandals, for example, and Middle Eastern music CDs. All of these things were made available on the market coinciding with the airing of the first novella. It's a very, complicated and well orchestrated, really, commercial campaign. This example of social merchandising by the network was echoed by an explosion of interest in things perceived as Arab, like belly dancing, such that enrollment in Sao Paulo belly dancing academies increased by as much as 80% as a result of the novella. Likewise, event planners enjoyed a boom in demand for festas Arabi, or Arab-themed parties, like the ones they saw on television, complete with Arab. By that, really, they mean Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian dishes, Egyptian and Lebanese music that were used as, as a soundtrack, belly dancers who were almost always Brazilian, right? And this, clonomania, so to speak, also spread to the 2002 Carnival Parade, which featured numerous parade dancers dressed in costumes worn by the novella's principal characters. And naturally, tourism to Morocco increased as well. So here we have many of the hallmarks of Orientalism, such as the collapsing of widely divergent cultural customs into an undifferentiated exotic norm, whether it's Moroccan or Lebanese or Egyptian, nobody knows the difference and it's all exotic, so that's fine, right? The fascination with a cultural other, construed as radically different, and the consumption frenzy of Arab exotica, as well as the touristic appeal generated by wide-angle camera and aerial shots of the deserts of the Sahara and the Medina and the tanneries, medieval tanneries of Fez, for example. I mean, this was kind of whenever the scene shifted to Morocco, you got this image and you knew, all right, we are now in Morocco. Right? This is, of course, Fez, and nearly half of the novella's action takes place there. Right? In fact, of course, Fez is not even close to the desert, being in the northern agricultural part of Morocco, whereas the Sahara Desert begins only several hundred miles to the east and south, as I've been able to determine. Yet the impression one gets from the novella is that the Medina rises out of the sands. You step outside of the Kasbah and you find the sand dunes and the caravans and the Bedouins and all. So that's the kind of the construction, really, of the scene as exotic, because people have, of course, an idea of the desert. So in addition to the homogenization of diverse cultural customs, we also find a deliberate collapsing of distinct geographies into one picturesque norm. I mean, often, and I show people this map here showing the agricultural, the economic activity. The green, of course, being the agricultural parts, and here is, where is the Fez is up there. There's a circle around it. Nowhere clear, nowhere close to the yellow, which indicates the desert. Nevertheless, a number of factors differentiate this kind of Orientalism from the familiar European and US varieties that Edward Said describes. European Orientalism, as Said argued, is wedded to an ideology of colonial mastery that constructs a hierarchy of superior and inferior cultures. Brazilian Orientalism is, of course, derived from the European, but it answers to different ideological imperatives that give it a unique character. European Orientalism posits the Aristotelian self-identity of East and West. These are supposed to be sort of self-contained, coherent entities that are absolutely different from each other and opposed to each other. That's the logic of classic Orientalism. The British poet Rudyard Kipling, who was described as the poet of empire, has a famous line that expresses this idea. He says, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." On this view, the East defines the West, and the West defines the East through the logic of the excluded middle, the one being what the other is not. As scholars like Martin Bernal and Maria Rosa Menocal have argued, the idea of Europe and of the West, therefore, required an effort of historical reconstruction that suppressed or purged African, Arab, and Asian contributions to European civilization in order to come up with this notion of the pure West, right? Which is depicted then as having descended directly through a tunnel of time from ancient Greece. Greece is supposed to have created itself out of nothing. Right? So that's the classic Orientalism. Nothing can be further from the Brazilian ideology of the racial democracy. Popularized by Gilberto Freire during the 1930s, it posits the racial and cultural mistura, or mixing, of Amerindians, Africans, and Europeans as the defining characteristic of Brazilian identity. An idea similar to notions of the cosmic race found in the work of Mexican Jose Vasconcelos and the Cuban Fernando Ortiz. So instead of absolute separation between entities, it's really about the fusion of different cultures and races. So to be Brazilian on this view is to carry the physical and cultural traces of that mixing and to recognize oneself as its product. Okay? So is Brazil Western then, right? And what are the investments of Brazilian Orientalism? So the answer to the first question is twofold. On the one hand, I would argue nobody is Western in Kipling's sense, because strictly speaking, the West, like the East, is an ideological fiction. On the other hand, if we ask whether in the worldview of the novella Brazil is Western, the answer would have to be yes, because a Brazil in dialogue with Islam appears more Western, and that is a desirable self-image for many among Brazil's largely Francophone intellectual elite, even though it does not fit with the idea of mixing premised on cultural anthropology and racial miscegenation and so on. Thus, as it negotiates Brazilian identity in relation to Islam and Arabs, the novella unself-consciously reveals certain anxieties about Brazil's identity and place in the world. As early as July 2001, so 3 months before the airing of the first episode, Gloria Perez declared that, as she had done earlier with Gypsies in another novella, Okloni would help Muslims, quote, undo a series of preconceptions that weigh on their shoulders. So she wants to, fight the stereotypes that sort of are attached to Muslims. She hoped to accomplish this by portraying Muslim families for the first time. All right, to kind of refute the predominant stereotype of Muslims as lone men who immigrated on their own, who work as pack peddlers, and they were described as Turcos, right? I mean, they were believed to be Turks because they came from the Ottoman Empire with Ottoman passports. Therefore, people thought they were Turks. And this, by the way, also existed in the United States. I mean, early immigrants from Syria and Lebanon were called Turks for the same reason. Okay? And this particular stereotype was a derogatory one. I mean, the Turco in Brazilian literature is an unscrupulous sort of merchant who has no qualms about deceiving and cheating and so on, and who cares only about money and so forth, right? However, by portraying Muslim families, Perez was breaking new ground in that sense. Right? Moreover, as part of the extensive research that prominent primetime novella writers normally do when tackling a social issue, she enlisted the help of Muslim community leaders in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, who advised her on questions of Islamic law and social practices related to things like marriage, divorce, and so forth, prayer, etc. Less than 2 weeks after 9/11, and a week before the much anticipated first episode aired, Perez was asked whether the suspicion hanging over Muslims in general was going to lead her to diminish the role of Islam in the novella. And especially that there were rumors that had been circulating that some actors withdrew from the cast. This is just, very shortly after 9/11. And her response was the following. And I'll just translate here for you. We have to say no to prejudice, to stop feeding this ignorance by showing ordinary people. Terrorism exists in all countries and among all peoples, and Muslims are peoples like us, end quote. Right? Yeah, it's a very virtuous intent. Yet, the advice of Muslim authorities that she solicited, as she wrote the novella, failed to prevent many problematic representations drawn from classic Orientalism, or to forestall criticism for those representations, most prominently from Abdelmalik Sharqawi Ghazwani, then Moroccan ambassador in Brazil, who published his comments on the embassy's website and also in Folha de Sao Paulo, which is the major newspaper in Brazil. Those representations are quite predictable, having mainly to do with male authority, polygamy, the status of women, and a host of other Orientalist obsessions like the veil, belly dancing, that one finds in a Flaubert or a Delacroix, as well as the depiction of Morocco as a primitive country stuck in the past. All of this is evidence of the novella's heavy debt to the Orientalist imagination. Okay? So he published this shortly after the airing of the last episode, and he called, he said that the novella's portrayal of Morocco was sympathetic, but nevertheless, it was a gross falsification. He said it missed the opportunity to educate Brazilians about another culture, and he wondered how would Brazilians, Brazilian producers feel if their country was presented as little more than, the country of carnival and soccer. And he said also that Morocco, as seen in novella, was very distant from reality, that it existed only in the author's imagination. Now, he made, 3 specific criticisms here. He said the image is disastrously inspired by the 1001 Nights, especially when it came to the representation of women who live in luxury and indolence. They are docile, submissive to the will of their guardians and their polygamous husbands, subject to threats of public floggings at the slightest show of disobedience, and so on. So the other criticism he made is that exoticism in the representation of Morocco as a Bedouin country, right? And again, all of this emphasis on the desert, as if and ancient Medinas, as though there were no modern cities. And also, he said that the novella ignored the complex processes of development and modernization. These are the charges that he made. Okay. Okay. For example, this is the main character, Jadi, sort of covering her face, and in a kind of an iconic, really, image that you still encounter today, even in the public markets where artists sell their works. Every once in a while, you come up against something like this, and people recognize that this is from the novella. Before commenting on this contradiction, I mean, you have a very progressive intent to, fight stereotypes. At the same time, you have all of these stereotypical representations. It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. But before commenting on it or trying to sort of explain it, let me give you a brief summary of the two main narrative threads in the story. Set in 1981, Ukloni opens with Dr. Albieri, a character, giving a lecture on the potential of therapeutic cloning and emphasizing that it represents that researchers must abide by medical ethics. All right? So that's Dr. Albieri and his two, the two twin sons of his closest friend. He's a geneticist. He's interested in cloning because in his youth he lost his fiancée to an accident, and since then he has been obsessed with the idea of preserving life, or through prolonging life, defeating death through cloning. So you have him in the first episode with these two sons. He is the godfather of one of them. They are twins, and he is taking them on a trip to Egypt, and he stands in front of the pyramids, and he said, well, the ancient Egyptians defeated death through mummifications. The 21st century will defeat death through cloning. Okay? And then, he is also represented as having cloned a sheep in 1981, 15 years before Dolly the sheep was born in Scotland. Right? So here, fiction, of course, but this is one way in which the novella participates in the construction of Brazilian national identity, showing us Brazilian science as just as advanced, in fact, even more advanced than European and American science. Okay, so that's the the main theme then of cloning. What happens is one of these two twins, his favorite, dies in a helicopter crash. So then, all over again, he lives the trauma of having lost a person very special to him. So he decides to clone him. Since these two are twins, their genetic makeup is the same. So he takes cells from the body of the surviving twin, and he injects its DNA into the egg of a woman who is seeking artificial insemination. And she gets pregnant, and then a healthy child is born who is going to grow up and be an identical image of these two twins. Okay? So that is the clone of the title. Okay. The theme, so here, I mean, the moral of all of this, of course, the clone grows up, and, all kinds of legal conundrums, who is his real father, who is his mother, et cetera, and the message of the novella here is that human cloning is a no-no. Right? It's an evil, and it should be avoided at all costs. And Albieri here emerges as, the Frankenstein figure who creates a monster. I mean, that's the kind of, the frame of reference in which we are led to understand him time and again. The theme of Islam enters into the story from the first episode and quickly begins to intertwine with that of cloning. Immediately after the first scene in which Albieri is introduced, the Moroccan teenage girl, Jaji, appears in a conservative one-piece bathing suit on a Rio de Janeiro beach, glancing wistfully at Brazilian lovers in much less modest apparel. I was going to show you a clip, but I'll skip over that for time. The idea is that, her parents went to Brazil, her father dies, she was born in Brazil, she grows up Brazilian in everything, but at home her parents are imposing on her all the Moroccan customs. She's not allowed to have sleepovers, she's not allowed to wear, a skimpy bathing suit, et cetera, et cetera. So she always feels that she is, that her freedom is restricted. So she goes home at one point to find that her mother is dying, all right? And her neighbor offers to help her, and she says, No, no, you can't help me. I have to wash my own mother. This is a Muslim custom. And then she goes on to talk about how it's only, close family members who wash the bodies of the deceased and so forth, right? Accurate or not, and there are many things that are, very, really inaccurate. But anyway, I mean, that is the kind of an example of this little mini lesson here about Muslim customs that you have. And then we are shown this scene, which would have been unthinkable, of course, in any production made in an Arab or a Muslim country. First of all, I mean, you don't show naked bodies. Secondly, you don't show a naked corpse, because there it's not just the nudity, but it's also a violation of a certain taboo, which is respect for the dead. And yet, because this novel is explaining Muslim customs, you get this shot from the ceiling showing you this is supposed to be Jadi and this is her mom. She's actually washing her. Okay? So where does this come from? It's very predictable. It comes from this tradition of 19th century Orientalist paintings. This is Delacroix, as you know, mid-19th century French painter. One of his most famous paintings, Odalisque allongé sur un divan. And in it, I mean, and this genre, I mean, for those who are not familiar with it, paintings that depict female nudes supposedly in a harem setting, in a Muslim harem setting, all right? Because of the idea, the mythology of the harem that was, prevalent in Europe at the time. The notion that, all of these women are locked up and they're guarded by slaves who are eunuchs, and, they are smoking opium. You always find, some kind of opium pipe, for example, here. They are semi-intoxicated. You can see, if you look at this figure's eyes, they're half closed. And they're, in any state of nudity. And there is always a couple of other things, actually two things. The partially drawn curtain, you can see that in the background, giving you the idea of enclosure, but also the sense that you are looking at something you're not supposed to be seeing. So a curtain is supposed to be drawn, but it is partially opened for you to be able to peep. And there is always some kind of dagger or sword or something suggesting violence, right? And there's a scabbard here at the bottom next to the opium pipe. Classic. I mean, these are the elements that you find in most of these kinds of paintings. This is another one by Ingres, another famous French poet from the same period. Partially drawn curtain. This one is not intoxicated, but, you have sort of the scabbard here at the bottom. And this is Ingres, also one of Ingres' most famous paintings called Le Bain Turc, or the Turkish bath. And it shows, I mean, look at the shape, the tondo, the round shape of the painting, suggesting to you that you are actually peeping through, a peephole, right? That you are looking at something that nobody would be allowed to see. So it's not just the idea of looking at naked bodies, but the tantalizing notion that you are seeing something that you are not permitted to see. In this case, it's supposed to be a bath, and again the nudity, again the music, the opium pipes scattered around, people semi-intoxicated, suggestions of lesbianism also in this particular painting. And then, the next shot in the novella. So you can see, I mean, this is kind of the depiction of of Jadi's mother's corpse is really alluding to these other Orientalist paintings that everybody knows. And then you have this other shot, remember in the first one you're looking directly at the scene. Now you're looking at the same scene reflected through an Oriental frame of a mirror, all right? An extra sort of turn in the screw to kind of draw your attention further to the fact that you are not looking directly at the object, but you're looking at the fact that you're looking, right? Which is what these other paintings were doing by drawing attention to the fact of actually peeping at something that is not permitted, okay? Not only that, I mean, all of this would have been perhaps a stretch, but for the fact that Jadi and other Moroccan women in the novella are often referred to as odaliscas or odalisques. So if you've missed all of these associations, it forces you back to it. She is an odalisque, and every Oriental woman is an odalisque as well. Okay? All right. So, of course, now with her mother dead, her father had already died, Jadi has to go to, all right, let's stay here for a moment. Jadi has to go back to Morocco, where she will live with her uncle, who is now her guardian, right? So she goes to Fez, and she meets her uncle's very important character called Ali, Uncle Ali, or Tio Ali, as he's called. And Tio Ali is a friend of Dr. Albieri, the Brazilian geneticist who creates a clone. Right? They went to college together in Brazil. So everybody knows everybody, all of these people's paths cross. Albieri takes Lucas with him, the surviving twin, and they are sitting in Ali's house. And of course, totally ignorant of the customs, Lucas leaves the two older men talking, gets up and wanders through the house, which is something you're not supposed to do, really, right? But he wanders into the women's quarters to find Jadi here in a two-piece bathing suit, dancing. And, these other women are standing around her and clapping and singing and so forth, right? Do you see that veil behind her? All right. So the moment they see each other, she's actually holding the veil across her face. And then when they see each other, they freeze. The women in the background, they scream. She drops the veil. They see each other for the first time. And of course, you guessed, they fall in love at first sight. All right? Very dramatic, very kind of Oriental, again, setting. This event, or these events, I mean, the kind of Jadi and his story and her meeting with Lucas, as well as the Albieri's creation of the clone, all of this occurs in 1981. All right? So several episodes taking place in 1981, and then the storyline resumes 20 years later. So action jumps to the present, 2001. By now, the baby clone, becomes a 20-year-old. Of course, these two are not allowed to marry each other in 1981. Her parents, her uncle doesn't let her, and Lucas's father doesn't permit him. He had been, thinking he will convert in order to marry Jadi, and his father berates him, and so it doesn't work. They go on, they marry different people, and 20 years later, the two couples, she and her husband, are separated, and he and his wife are also kind of estranged, and they have children. Right? So, all right. Throughout this period, several times, Lucas and Jadi plan to run away together. And every time, she packs her suitcase, goes to meet him, and he doesn't show up. Right? He's a weak character. He's not somebody who really stands up for himself. There's some kind of excuse, or he just fails to fall through. And every time she is, you see her several times in this way. So this is important because in Orientalist narratives of the 19th century, an example being, Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Right? Where the character, the English protagonist, he finds an Indian woman who is about to be burned on the pier, along with the dead body of her husband, and he kidnaps her and takes her back to England and marries her. Right? So one critic by the name of Gayatri Spivak has described this kind of story as white men saving brown women from brown men. It's the notion that Oriental women are oppressed, and only white men can save them from brown men. All right? What happens here in Novella is not that at all. Okay? The supposedly white man, the Brazilian, constantly fails to save the Muslim woman. She is the one who actually has the guts to go through with the and so with all of these Orientalist sort of associations, nevertheless, you have important deviations from the Orientalist cliches. Right? So this is one thing, and then the other thing is, of course, there's a sense of distance, that is always emphasized in Orientalism. Not only geographical distance, the Orient is a place that is very far, right? But it's also the cultural difference. Here, this distance is constantly being, narrowed. So you get the sense of a constant traffic between Brazil and Morocco. As far as I know, there are no direct flights between Brazil and Morocco. You always have to go, through Spain or France or something, right? And yet, these characters, Brazilians, Moroccans, they're constantly, the easiest thing for them is get on the plane and go to the other country, right? All of them are traveling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? Several of the Moroccan characters are born there. Jadi is one. The man she married is also one of two brothers who Moroccans, and they have a sister, and they're all born and raised in Brazil, and they're all perfectly fluent in, in Portuguese and so on. So you have these, this sense that, there's a much more contact between East and West, so to speak. Even so, at every turn, the Moroccans express their shock and disapproval at the dress and behavior of Brazilians. Right? Even the Moroccans who are born and raised in Brazil, every time they see somebody on the street wearing skimpy dress, like, oh my God, and so on. Islam and Muslims are presented as completely alien to Brazil, and because they refuse to mix with Brazilians. And there's a certain, kind of determinism. Jadi, for example, and her Brazilian-born niece are portrayed as having, because they were born and raised in Brazil, they're having Western, desires. Like they want to marry for love, for instance. They see themselves going to college and having a career, right? Whereas the women born in Morocco are seen or represented as not believing in love. They are going to submit to being married, in arranged marriages because they believe that love comes with cohabitation, as the elders keep saying, and that you don't really need to get a career, go to college or get a degree or an education or get a career, because then you'll marry a rich husband and he'll give you lots of gold, right? That's the kind of the cliche that also keeps being repeated, right? So you have, a whole bunch of contradictory, really, representations, deviating from the stereotypes, but then confirming the stereotypes. So two features differentiate this kind of binarism, really, from what I would be calling the Northern, right, or the European North American Orientalism. So first, in the Brazilian version of Orientalism, or Southern Orientalism, difference does not automatically denote negativity or inferiority. It is explicitly presented as neutral. But when it carries a charge, it may be negative, or it may be positive also. Okay? And there's a certain cultural relativism that keeps being emphasized. So viewers are reminded by various characters, time and again, right, that it's another culture. It's a way of seeing the world that is neither better nor worse than ours. It's only different. This is a sentiment that is expressed literally, right, by different characters over and over again. Similar statements are made by many characters, always in reaction to members of one or the other group expressing surprise or puzzlement or disapproval at the behavior of members of the other group. Moreover, there's mutual comprehension on both sides. And of course, in a context such as this, you can imagine that it leads to hilarious situations. But such situations almost always end in extended explanations of cultural differences. More radically, audience assumptions about difference are frequently undermined in the service of social critique. So, for example, one Brazilian character by the name of Laurinda asks Jadi's cousin Latifa if she wouldn't prefer to have been born Brazilian so that she wouldn't have to get permission from her husband before she leaves the house. And this is Latifa's reaction, instantaneous, no way, Deus nos livre, God forbid, I wouldn't want that at all. Brazilian women's luck is bad, really, but you have no man to take care of you. You live in fear of getting fat, fear of having cellulite. You can't take your eyes off your husband or he'll run away. Isn't that so? Okay? So, Laurinda, of course, totally stunned by this unexpected response and cannot help but agree. However, in the same episode, a little later, Jadi is shown having to steal her own passport from her husband's safe. He keeps it locked in a safe, right, to prevent her from going anywhere. She has to steal her passport and run to the airport in order to in one of her plans to run away with Lucas. And at the airport, they prevent her from boarding the plane because she doesn't have a written permission from her husband. So, Muslim women are imprisoned, after all, okay? Brazilian women are suffering from all of these anxieties, and Brazilian and Moroccan women are locked up and they don't have any freedom. Right? So the novella is really what it's doing is doing a double critique, as you might say. It's showing that the situation of women in both countries is difficult and precarious, but one of them is not necessarily better than the other. You get your freedom, but then you lose your peace of mind, right? And so on. So the treatment of gender in the novella shows that while there are striking contrasts between Brazil and Morocco, the situation of both cultures is very difficult, right? And then there is another important thing that differentiates Northern and Southern Orientalisms, and that is whereas the Northern Orientalism insists that East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet, in Kipling's words. In the Brazilian variety, the twain do meet, okay? So despite all of these differences, there are, very important similarities. One of them is the love of music and dancing, okay? The novella, as I said, fetishizes belly dancing and presents Muslim women as bedroom belly dancers, even though they might be covered head to toe on the streets. But Brazilian families are throwing parties for every birth and every person who leaves and every time somebody comes back, and their love for music, and these two very, very pious elders who go and contract belly dancers to animate these parties. And so, very happy Muslims. That's the image that we get. And so are the inhabitants of the neighborhood of São Cristóvão in Rio de Janeiro, where two other Moroccan couple settle. And there, too, you see parties breaking on the street for every occasion, for every national holiday, and sometimes spontaneously as well. And you see here the character of Dona Jura. She's the owner of the local bar. And every few episodes, there's a famous singer or a celebrity, who stops by her bar. Pelé, for example, very famous samba musicians. And on these occasions, parties break out, and on the street, people are dancing on the street until the early hours of dawn. So here too, and not only that, but there is also 2 or 3 weddings of Brazilian and Moroccan characters that take place in the novella, and they play both kinds of music, Brazilian music and and Arabic music, and people dance. They teach each other how to dance differently, right? So the more substantive difference in this respect is not between Brazilians and Moroccans, but between the working class residents of São Cristóvão which is a neighborhood in the north of Rio de Janeiro, and the rich counterparts who inhabit the mansions and villas of the city's south side. The rich Brazilians are neither cheerful nor musical. Their broken homes and dysfunctional marriages produce troubled teens and playboys who often fall prey to drugs. And I mean, that's the kind of, the representation we get. And there is, in fact, another love story, a forbidden love story between the girl, by the name of Mel, Lucas's daughter, granddaughter of a millionaire, and her bodyguard, who is, in fact, the son of Dona Jura that we see on the screen here. It's a forbidden love story, not because of cultural difference, but because of class difference. Right? And this is something that is emphasized very strongly in the novella as well. So, unlike European and US Orientalisms, the play of difference and similarity in the Brazilian variety disrupts intuitive assumptions about self and other. It disperses rather than consolidates. And moreover, and this brings me here to the final point I want to make, Brazilian Orientalism has a tertiary, not a binary structure. Binary structure, self-other, right? Or east-west. In Brazilian Orientalism, you have east-west, and then you have south. So, as we've seen, the understanding of Morocco is filtered through French representations and then going to Brazil. So there's always this triangular movement. And likewise, Brazil's self-image is constructed in this tertiary way. It's not just against an other who is like the East or Islam, as in Europe. It's against that, but also against the North, Europe and the United States. And that is something that the story of the geneticist makes clear. He is somebody who succeeds in cloning a sheep 15 years before Dolly, and who succeeds in cloning a human being, which is, unthinkable, right? So what that shows is, how excellent Brazilian scientists are. And throughout, if watch a lot of these novellas, you'll see similar things similar claims are being made. Brazilian cuisine is just as good as French cuisine, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how the novella participates in the construction of national identity. But it's always, when you insert Islam and Arabs in the picture, it becomes this triangular structure, not the binary structure. It's not just East and West. Okay. In the final analysis, this Brazilian Orientalism, as manifested in the novella, is evidence of anxiety about Brazil's own cultural identity as a post-colonial nation that differentiates itself from the erstwhile mother country of Portugal through ideas of racial fusion and cultural anthropophagy, or the absorption of and digestion of Native American, European, African, and Asian influences to produce a uniquely Brazilian mixture. Yet, the intellectual elites in Brazil have historically also looked to Europe, particularly France, and more recently to the United States, as the embodiment of completed progress and civilization, ideals seen to be still unrealized in what Stefan Zweig once called the country of the future, Brazil, right? Which seems unable to rid itself of internal contradictions and social dilemmas. It's a country of the future because it has the size and the resources, the human as well as the natural resources, to become a world power, and yet it is not a world power now, but it has the potential in the future to evolve into a world power, right? So Brazilian intellectuals sometimes, they joke about their country being perennially always the country of the future, a future that never arrives. Right? So it's a source of great anxiety, really. And this paradox is embedded in what I would venture to say is the original purpose behind Gloria Perez's decision to include Islam into a novella focusing primarily on human cloning long before 9/11 turned the spotlight on Muslims. As I mentioned earlier, the theme of cloning unfolds in a Faustian narrative of a Brazilian geneticist and strong advocate of medical ethics who sacrifices his ideals when he decides to clone the twin brother of his godchild. Mixed with his atheistic desire to play God, that's how it's represented, right? Is his ambition to accomplish a feat that his European and US colleagues deem impossible, which is to create a healthy human clone. The moral dilemma, which Dr. Albieri embodies, the dictates of ethics versus the temptations of science, encodes an anxiety about Brazilian identity as a Catholic country, very religious country, that risks losing its spiritual moorings as it strives to realize its promised, though seemingly forever delayed, prominence on the world stage. Okay? Within this difficult equation, Islam figures as a spiritual ballast where Catholicism apparently falters. For the counterweight to Albieri's faith in science is not the Catholic priest Padre Maccioli, who is introduced into the story almost as an afterthought and not until the final weeks, but the pious Moroccan patriarch Ali, Tio Ali, right, who debates religion, science, and faith with Albieri. Ali is the wise old man of the novella, and he spreads his pearls of wisdom in almost every episode. And whenever he pronounces on matters of spiritual or philosophical weight, Gregorian chants invariably play in the background, signaling to the viewers that he speaks truths common to both religions. In this way, Ali serves as the moral and spiritual compass, orienting the rest of the characters, or indexing their deviation from the standards of behavior that the novella upholds. Ali represents not only a counterbalance to the fanatical Abdu, the other Moroccan elder, but also he represents an Islam that is more Catholic than Catholicism. I mean, imagine the irony of it with Gregorian chants playing in the background whenever he begins to speak. Right? In the final episode, Albieri and the clone Leo disappear in a desert storm in Morocco, which erases from the world what is presented as a gross violation of social, ethical, and spiritual norms, much as the icy fields of the North Pole, the icy plains of the North Pole, rid the world of Frankenstein and his monster. So they're in Morocco, they walk out of the Medina into the desert, and on comes a sandstorm, and they walk into it, and they never come back, right? Remember the ending of Frankenstein. This is what we're being, reminded of here, right? This is a redemptive Orient. It's not an Orient that destroys you. It's, in classic 19th century narratives, the Orient is a place where you lose your bearings, or Africa, for example. No, this is a redemptive Orient, though, of course, no less Orientalized than the Orient of 19th century Europe. In both cases, the Orient is an ideal other. But while that other serves to consolidate Europe's identity as a superior colonial power, Gloria Perez's Carioca Orientalism exposes the anxieties and dilemmas that continue to trouble Brazil's post-colonial self-image. Thank you. Thank you. There's a couple more slides here. The final episode, after Albieri and the clone disappear, you see here Jadi and Lucas running toward each other, also in the desert. They're going to be reunited at the end, and then you get this. Right? Remember that sort of reflection of her washing her body in the same Oriental frame, and of course the caravan in the background. It just doesn't get any more cliche than that. So I'm happy to take questions.
So there's a lot of misappropriation of this culture. When we came here, the 56 of us from the States, they told us that we couldn't even hold hands in public. And within a couple weeks, everyone here was like, that's fine, all the kids do it. So it's not that big of a deal. So we even have that going on within UNE, some of the staff. To what extent is this a bad thing? Like you said that it increased tourism here to Morocco, right? So if it incites people to come and experience the culture for themselves, is it inherently a bad thing that they misappropriated and basically got almost everything wrong with Moroccan culture?
Well, it depends on what one considers important. I've quoted the comments of the Moroccan ambassador in Brazil. He found this representation to be sympathetic, but very offensive. Okay, so that's the. I mean, I think that's the dilemma here. It did do some good things, and actually, I mean, not even before tourism, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was a lot of anxiety in Brazil about Muslims and about the Muslims in Brazil. But, and I have a dear colleague who's done research on this, an anthropologist, and who went and interviewed people and so on, and he was actually there during the airing of this novella, and and he was kind of recording the signs of anxiety or Islamophobia, if you wish. And he says that as soon as the novella began to air, these sentiments dwindled. And all of a sudden, it was normal. It was on television. The Muslims were on TV, on prime time. They were normal. They were young and old and families and this and that. And it diffused the tension around Islam, at least some of the tension around Islam in Brazil. So that is a positive effect. I mean, there was nothing like that in the United States, right? But while doing that, I mean, it also perpetuated some stereotypes that come from another context, and which one still observes. I mean, I showed you that picture of Jadi wearing the face veil, which you still find today in the Sunday market in Ipanema, for instance. If you go and it's like, what is that? Where does that come from? But that's still an idea about Muslim women. I mean, the notion that Muslim women are taught not to seek education, for instance. I mean, this is I mean, these are very strange ideas in this day and age. So it's a mixed bag. It's there are a lot of positive things, and that's why I found this so fascinating. It's because of its contradictions. I mean, there were a lot of positive effects. I mean, the impulse was quite progressive. And some of the results of this were good, but also there were a lot of other representations that were problematic and that were perpetuated and reinforced.
Just a quick follow-up, I suppose, then. Just because they got a lot of things wrong, there were still good aspects and there were bad aspects. It could be a gross misappropriation, but on the other end, maybe you're not so suspicious of your neighbor.
Right.
Would you say maybe overall, is it a good thing that they implemented that storyline, or if retroactively, do you think from your perspective at least that they should have left that storyline out altogether?
Well, no, I mean, obviously, I mean, it's a good thing that it was included in the novella, right? I mean, I wouldn't be here talking about it, for instance, right? So we wouldn't be discussing these very complicated questions, so it was an opportunity to shed a positive light, a humanizing light on Muslims in Brazil, and that's clearly a good thing, right? It also allows us to debate these issues now, and I mean, I know one of the experts that Gloria Perez consulted is a professor of Arabic at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I asked him, what did you think of that controversy? And he said, hey, bobagem, it was nonsense. It was a successful novella. I was like, okay, And so he agrees with you. He thinks it was a very good thing. Therefore, everything else is, really not that important. But there are also other Brazilians who think, that these representations were offensive and problematic. So. No. I'm happy also to take questions in Arabic if anybody would like to ask questions in Arabic.
Hi, thank you for the Magnificence conference lecture. So I would like to, knowing that Okloni TV Serie had a big success in Brazil, and also knowing that broke all the records of audience in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So in general, what kind of impact left on Brazilian people this Okloni. And if in reality, in your opinion, has improved the image of Morocco in Brazil or made it worse?
Well, you know, I mean, it's very difficult to answer, you know, that question in a sort of in a very simple, straightforward way, to say it was positive or that it was negative. I mean, as I said in response to the previous question, there were a lot of good things that came out of it. A lot of Brazilians started coming to Morocco, you know, for tourism. I mean, and aside from the economic impact of that, which is great, also we have people coming here and seeing the country for themselves, and perhaps realizing that some of the images they got from the novella were inaccurate, right? So that's a good thing. I mean, I think overall it did improve the image of it did not lead anybody to think that Islam is, you know, progressive, or that that it's any less conservative, or any of these things. But it's a religion with a great spiritual message. I mean, as I was talking about, you know, Uncle Ali character, he has the last word in novella. He's the one who narrates the last 10, 15 minutes of the last episode. And he gets to say all the most profound things in the novella that Gloria Perez wants us, you know, to know. I mean, this is also a kind of a didactic medium. I mean, there's a lot of melodrama, but there's also a lot of, you know, teaching, the entertainment education, the intent of the best writers, and at least, is to entertain, but also to educate. And a lot of the education in this novella comes from the mouth of this enlightened, elder Muslim, practicing Muslim Moroccan man. So that was good, right? So I mean, I think it would be really frivolous to ignore that, or to minimize its importance. So I mean, it did shed a good light on Islam. At the same time that it also perpetuated some very false notions. I mean, the fact that Muslim women, you know, Moroccan women are locked up, that they can't leave the house without their husband's permission, that their passports are not with them, that, you know, they would be turned away back from the airport, that they would be flogged in public if, you know, they disobeyed their husband, for instance. I mean, I mean, where did that come from, you know? So it's as I said, it's a mixed bag. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you for this great lecture. I have a lot of things in mind to say, but I don't know how to. Well, I wish. I hope that I'm going to succeed in telling what I'm thinking. I think we have all in mind as Arabic some reflections of Orientalism cliché, because most of us we have read books coming from France, and maybe we have known our history by foreign books.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
That's the first thing. Because, for example, the woman with the face veil, if you go to a common market here in Morocco, you find the same pictures, and we have that in mind, and it doesn't disturb us. We think it's normal. It's
right.
part of our culture. Secondly, talking about the novella, it's amazing to see. That's why it's superficial. It's always has great success, and even I have in mind, for example, American series like Falcon Crest, Dallas. They didn't actually reflect what is United States culture, but they give what the people want to see. If you reflect what is. For example, if this telenovela was respecting really the Arabic culture, maybe it had been a little bit boring, you know, because the goal of the novela was entertainment, not educating, of course, and that's what explains the great success it has. My question will be. How can you explain, for example, this great success? Because 75% of the people was watching
Yeah.
it. That's a huge success.
Right.
Well, I can understand that ambassador was a little bit confused about this, but still, how can you explain this success?
What explains it? Yeah. I mean, I think, the interest of the exoticism of the theme, this is one thing, but also the timing of it, you know? I mean, this begins to air October 1st, 2001, 3 weeks after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The world's eyes are focused on Muslim countries. And here, on prime time, you have a novella about Muslims. So, so the people who are not going to pay attention to novellas are now paying attention. So the timing of it, this was just a complete coincidence, but it did serve the purpose of, it's not intentional really, but it focused the attention really on the television screen because people wanted to know how these Muslim, there was great curiosity about Islam too that peaked, but also, as we said, this is an open genre. How was the author going to deal now with this situation? She's already written several months' worth of episodes before 9/11. What was going to happen later? And we saw, this was really the main plot for the entire first half. Only later did what was supposed to be the main theme, cloning, come back into the and re-enter the picture, right? So there was that interest too. You wanted to see how the novella was going to develop and reflecting the current events and of course the reactions of the people to it. But I think without 9/11, without a doubt, it wouldn't have been as successful.
Well, thank you so much, Waïl, and thank you so much also for attending. Now we'll have a reception outside. If you have more questions, please ask him, and we'll continue the conversation in the hallway.